objective logic, so we can get at least a basic sense, the overarching sense, of how that trajectory of that argumentation flows. So we're going to do that. But pursuing that same aim, we also need to focus in on a part of that argument that we only noted in our previous discussions. We didn't really go into this in detail last quarter. And that's actually the explicit transition, which is literally in the very final paragraph, right, of the objective logic, the transition from essence to concept. Because we need to identify there just what it is about essence, and specifically about the category of actuality, and its subcategories of modality and causality, that of themselves, right, imminently and necessarily entail the transition to the concept. Or as Hegel phrases it, what is it exactly about actuality that necessarily raises or elevates necessity to freedom? Because everything we've talked about up to this point, you could characterize under the modality of necessity. What elevates that of itself, not something doing it to it from extraneously, but does it of itself? What elevates that, raises that from necessity to freedom? So we have a twofold agenda then in our session today. One is to review the master argument of the objective logic. And then the second bit will be to examine in detail the account of the transition from essence to the concept, that section entitled The Reciprocity of Action. Now, so that's the main things I want to try to grapple with and get to today. But before we take up those tasks, I want us to begin the quarter by broadening again our perspective in order to gain some appreciation of what Hegel has contributed to the conceptual space in which his work initially emerged. And for that, I want to recall how we initially situated Hegel's thought as a moment in the development of post-Kantian idealism. So I want to zoom back out historically now and situate this text we've been reading intensely and intimately and directly. I want to stand back out from it and look at it in its historical context again for just a moment to reassert that for purposes I hope will be useful in just a second. So I said that Hegel is one figure within what we call the monistic turn in post-Kantian idealism. One figure in the monistic turn in post-Kantian idealism. So I want to come back and talk about what that monistic turn was about, and then how Hegel figures into it prominently here in just a second. So I'll be brief, but let me just remind you of some things I said at the very beginning of last quarter. So we said that post-Kantian idealism emerged out of a set of core convictions. The first conviction was that Kant had indeed succeeded in creating the most resourceful philosophical system in modern times, a system that was deeply committed to the unity of reason, the centrality of human autonomy, and one that enabled us to gain a genuinely coherent conception of the world. There's no going back before that to the post-Kantians, right? They weren't rejecting that. They thought that was uncircumventable. You could not go back before Kant. Everything proceeds, some form, fashion, or other, post-Kant. It's the only way it could. But at the same time, so that's Kant to be praised, right? But that same Kantian system that they just praised also presented an impasse for them. Right? So it's uncircumventable, you cannot go back before it, yet it contains an impasse. What's that impasse? It's committed to the right thing, the unity of reason, the system of reason. But what it's not committed to is a way of getting there that will ensure its success. In other words, all the post-Kantians thought Kant was right about the unity of reason, but wrong about the methodology by which you could get there, because his methodology was fatally flawed. That fatal flaw in his methodology was the distinction, which he said was absolutely central to what he was doing, between the phenomenal and the numinal. So he was entangled in a dualistic mode of thought that would inevitably prevent him from attaining genuine unity of reason. The post-Kantians would say, in a kind of trite phrase, if you need any testimony for that, look at the third critique. This is Kant struggling, right, to produce what he wants and believes must be produced, a systematic unification of the theoretical and the practical. And yet, being unable to do so, why? Because he's committed ultimately to the bridge between them being, is it phenomenal, is it numinal, is it regulative, is it constitutive? I mean, therein lies the problem. right, is that he can't bring off that combination. So their conclusion, of course, was that Kant's project is correct in its basic aim. He was seeking after the systematic unity of reason. That's what we must seek after. But it betrays this noble goal by its own dualistic methodology. So their proposal, what makes them post-Kantians, and not just Kantians anymore, but post-Kantians, their proposal was in order to overcome Kant's impasse, his philosophy must be set on a new monistic foundation. Here's the monistic term. So the transcendental term was necessary, correct, and uncircumventable, but it needed to be followed, supplemented by a monistic turn, a turn away from the dualisms of Kant's thought to affirm a monistic whole, for it is only such a foundation, a monistic foundation, that can truly establish the unity of reason. Now, so far, so good, right? I've made that intentionally broad, hopefully not too intentionally vague, but intentionally broad to capture a lot of different figures. Because, what unites Reinhold, Fichte, and others is not, the same thing ultimately, but they would all agree to what I just said. Right? They're all followers of Kant in this way. They all see their mission, broadly speaking, as trying to work out the monism to supplement Kant's transcendental turn. So I think they're all emblematic of a monistic turn in thought, in modern German thought at this point. And then I've divided into, this is, you can argue about, is there 3, is there 2, is there 14? I try to keep it down to 3. So 3 different groups within this monistic term. So the 3 groups are the epistemic monism. Here you were talking about early Reinhold, early Fichte. They wanted to unite the unity of reason in a fundamental axiomatic principle. So it's epistemic for them. What we need is a fundamental principle of all knowledge. So axiomatic, unquestionably, indubitably, self-evidently true, and then derive all knowledge from that. That's how you have unification. It's really ultimately about justification for them, so it's an epistemic concern. So again, that's early Reinhold, early Fichte. Practical monism is the second grouping. Here we're talking about a pretty diverse group of people. They wouldn't have agreed about a lot of other stuff, but they did agree about this. We're talking about people like Schiller, Herder, the earlier German romantics of Schlegel and Novalis. They said we want the unification of reason, but the unification of reason has to be rooted in the unity of human dignity, in the unity of human flourishing. So rather than an epistemic concern, their concern was what I'm broadly calling practical. Practical in the sense that they saw it as a moment in or flowing out of the unity of human dignity, the unity of human flourishing. In other words, for them, a philosophical anthropology was the key missing from Kant. So there's your first 2 groups, the epistemic monist, the practical monist. Then finally the ones that we're studying, and then Hegel belongs to this group obviously, is ontological monism. Ontological monism. This is the Tübingen classmates. This is Hölderlin, who's really the progenitor of this. You want a date for it, it's 1795. He writes a little fragment called Being, well, it doesn't have a name, we gave it a name later. Being, Possibility, Judgment. And it really does set this way of thinking going. So it's Hölderlin, Schelling, and Hegel. Those are the main proponents of the ontological monism, They believe that the unity of reason, Kant's project for unification of reason, must be rooted in the unity of being itself. So rather than epistemology being fundamental or the practical being fundamental for them, they thought metaphysics was fundamental. You have to do that as first philosophy. You can't do anything else. Now, I want to come back and kind of issue what I think is a kind of status update of where Hegel, of what Hegel is contributing to that movement. What Hegel is contributing to that movement thus far. So if we just step back and we said, okay, if all we had was the objective logic, if we didn't have the subjective logic which we're about to plow through and work in detail through, if we just had this, if that's all you had, then what would the report be? What would you say was Hegel's contribution to the monistic term? What was his account of that? And here I'm just going to try to summarize it and stay away from too much jargon, but there'll be a little bit of jargon here, I apologize, but just to state some things that I think are established tenets of Hegel's metaphysics at this point. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of the thatness of things and their whatness, right? So the existence of things, the thatness, and the whatness, their essence of things. So for anything to be at all, that is, for anything to exist, Hegel calls that quality, anything to exist or to be real, and to exist as a discrete entity, that's what he calls quantity, is for it to be in a continual state of change along a continuum. That's what he calls measure. So if you just stop for a moment there, that's the nodal line, image. He's literally making the claim, because we're working here at the level of ontology. So this is not a special metaphysics. It's not a metaphysics of God or the soul or the world. This is an account of being qua being. So anything that is in any sense of that word, anything that is at all, this is true of it. So this is true of this notebook, it's true of this table, it's true of this phone, it's true of us, it's true of the clock, it's true of everything, that it has these features, or it doesn't exist. It just isn't at all. Now, the changes in the state of things, so we've said things are undergoing these changes, right, from one state to another. The changes in the state of things is the actualization of possibilities that are inherent in some prior state of affairs. So this is really, in a sense, the argument not of being, the doctrine of being, but the doctrine of essence, right? There are no essences for Hegel. This is the kind of the shocking claim, right, in the doctrine of essence, is there are no essences. What we mean by essences, the whatness of things, not the thatness, but the whatness of things, comes from the fact that there are possibilities that are set in place by various configurations of already existing actualities. So things in existence somehow or another. And they contain possibilities within them. And those possibilities either at some point or another come to be actualized or they don't. And that coming to be actualized is what gives rise to everything else. So in that sense, the whatness of something is that it was a possibility within a prior state of affairs. There is no transcendent essence. Remember, all essences must appear, says Hegel, right? And to appear means exactly this. It means to be actualization of a prior set of possibilities. So we can say then that literally everything that exists is kind of mind-blowing. Everything that I think it is. Everything that exists of necessity. Now, of course, it means a lot hinges on what you mean by necessity in that claim. So if everything exists of necessity, and if that meant, it doesn't by the way, but if that meant it necessarily had to be this from time immemorial, then everything would be exactly as it must be. But that's not Hegel's claim. Because what he means by necessity is relative to a prior state of affairs. Relative to a prior state of affairs. So it's necessary, given that a prior state of affairs contained this possibility and all the conditions were met and it came about. So everything exists of necessity as a result of a prior state of affairs containing that possibility being actualized. That and that only. Did it have to be this way? No more than that prior state of affairs had to be that way, and it didn't either. So we can say then that each entity is thus necessary, not in itself, but relative to the prior conditions from which it emerges, and upon which it is thus contingent. Contingent in the sense of dependent. So everything that is of necessity, but it is of necessity means that it's contingent on the prior state of affairs that have existed. And that's true of the prior state of affairs as well. That goes back and goes back and goes back. That's a chicken egg problem eventually. So in this sense, everything that is, in any sense of that word is, exists by virtue of its relations with all other things that have or that will or that do exist. There's Hegel's monism. You could also call it a holism. Right? I think it's equally, it's not one thing, right, as we might tend to think about it. We'll come back to this when we talk about substance, right? Because clearly there he's talking about a kind of substance monism, but notice what he says about substance. It's not a thing unto itself. So it's a relationalism. It's a relational. His monism is a relationalism. Everything is what it is by virtue. Literally everything is connected with everything else, either directly or indirectly. Everything that exists is because of what it is by virtue of being following from that which is a prior state of affairs. So everything is necessarily, strike that. Everything is contingent upon everything else. Everything is contingent upon everything else. And everything is necessary, but only with respect to all other things. Everything is contingent, everything is dependent on everything else. Everything is necessary for the same reason. It's dependent on everything else. So far, so good? Now, the only thing, and I use that word cautiously here because it's not a thing, but we'll talk about it that way for the moment. The only thing that is absolutely, as opposed to relatively necessary, the only thing that's absolutely necessary, you could also say for Hegel, the only thing that's absolutely contingent, because he thinks at the absolute level they mean the same thing. That is, the only thing that's necessary or contingent in itself is the generative process, what he calls absolute negativity, determinate negation, whereby all that is came to be and will come to be and is what it is. So this process that we've alluded to already, with this becoming of a possibility of becoming actualized, that process is what's ineliminable. That's what's necessary in itself. But he's quite quick to tell us, I'm trying to emphasize this quite a bit at the end of last quarter. He says, this is on page 488, it's 392 in the German, that generative process or activity has no directionality of its own, has no purpose, has no telos. It is, as Hegel puts it on 488, this is 392 in the German, it's a blind collapse into otherness. A blind collapse into otherness. So if you go back to the nodal line image for just a moment, what you can say about everything is that it exists, it has reality, it has discreteness about it, it has those things and it's going to change. And what you could say by virtue of the doctrine of essence is that that change is a result of possibility being actualized. But what can you know about that possibility being actualized? That it'll collapse into otherness. Why? For no good reason. I mean, that's the point. It's blind. It doesn't have any goal that it's seeking out to attain. So at this level, the generative process that creates all things and also destroys all things is blind. Hegel has a name for that process at this point. He calls it power, Macht. He begins calling it that on 491 when he talks about this causal power of substance, that it produces things, brings things about. It's causing them to be. That's all he means by that. So we hear causality, we immediately go to mechanistic causality. That's not where Hegel's going. But he's also not immediately going to teleological causality either. So be cautious about, as always with Hegel, when he starts talking about causal power, Macht in this case, you want to quickly align it with things we're quite familiar with. That's always precarious to do that. So at this point we can say, at least we can say this much thus far, that the conclusion of the argument of the objective logic, the monism that Hegel has established thus far, is a monism of generative process, a monism of determinate negation. For all things are one, hen kai pan, to use the Greek phrase for that, all and one and all, because they are all in, through, and by means of the creative and destructive power of determinate negation. So, if you ask Hegel, is everything one? He'll say, yeah, all is one. Well, is it all in one substance? No. Because there's no undergirding, underlying substance. This is his problem with Spinoza, right? He thinks this Spinozistic view is, this is his critique of Spinoza, valid or not is another matter, but his critique of Spinoza is that Spinoza always thought of substance in a, at best, mechanical causality way. And so it's dead. It's dead matter. It doesn't have any way of accounting for how anything comes to be. So he says, if that's what you mean by monism, then no. But if what you mean by monism is a process that engenders, generates, creates, destroys everything, then yeah, it's all, everything is one in determinate negation. Everything is, because it is by way of, by virtue of, and it is ultimately determinate negation. Does that make a little bit of sense? Questions, problems, issues about that? I'm trying to pack a lot into a little. There's much to be questioned there, but does that at least make sense as an overview of where we've gotten to so far with Hegel? So I wanted to come back to that monism question because I thought it was useful to situate, Hegel is a monist, but what kind of monism do we have thus far? Right? And we have a generative monism. All right. Now let's take a look at the master argument of the objective logic. So that's this up here again. We've looked at this before. I'm going to be very brief about it because I just want to rehearse the major moves of it. Yeah, well, please.
Where is this critique of Spinoza's mechanistic? Like, does this, do you have like off the top of your head like line page numbers?
Where is the criticism of Spinoza?
As mechanistic.
As mechanistic? Yeah, so it's in the, I think it's in the remarks here, but it's more explicitly laid out in the history of philosophy, lectures on the history of philosophy, where he goes to Spinoza directly and does this. Yeah. Other comments, questions before we go? Yeah, please, Ken.
Tangentially, but is there anywhere where Spinoza addresses the epistemic post-Kantians? So, Victor Reinhold.
Or Spinoza?
No. Going back to those three sort of post-Kantian schools, just somewhere where he addresses Victor and Reinhold and associated.
Yeah. So, where Hegel does this, right? So, already at the beginning of, think back to the introductory materials in the Science of Logic, where he's saying, well, you could think about this as it has to go back to a fundamental Grundsatz, has to go back to a fundamental principle. Well, that's Fichte and Hegel. Right? That's the historical figures he's talking about. And he says, but that would have to be appealed to through some kind of direct awareness, intellectual intuition, to be able to grant this kind of indubitable ground status. And he says, but that's already to assert something without warrant. That's already to belie. He thinks that's a belying of the Kantian legacy, because the Kantian legacy demands that all positions be demonstrated. He doesn't think Kant successfully does that, but that's the inheritance that we should take from Kant. And so he doesn't think that Fichte and early Reinhold are able to do that, right, for that reason, because all they can do is assert this. So that's the epistemic monistic move. He doesn't have a sort of a direct critique in the same way that I just elaborated for either Spinoza or for Reinhold and Fichte. He doesn't have that for Schelling. Sorry, he has it for Schelling, but not so much for Schlegel or Schiller or the other early German romantics. That he does mostly through implication and other things. Is that useful? Other comments? Good. So just walk back through this. This is my reconstruction of the argument of the objective logic. And as always, if it's helpful, good. If it's not, chunk it, because I'm not wedded to it. It's not some miraculous thing. It's not true by virtue of the fact that it now looks like it has premises and conclusions. It's just hopefully a tracking of the argument and its major breaks is what I'm trying to really capture. So what I've said a moment ago is a version of this, so I won't belabor the point terribly much. So you get down to conclusion one, the truth of being is essence, by showing that measure entails essence, right? That the category of measure, it can't actually measure itself. It has to reflect into something other than itself, and that other than itself is essence. But what essence turns out to be is that essence must itself show itself. Essence must appear. So essence is inherently self-contradictory, Hegel's argue. So because it's self-contradictory, it must other itself. To other itself means it must appear. So that appearing, which is conclusion 2, right, is essence must appear. And then he says, this is the 9, 10, and 11 that we've really been focused on the last bit of our discussion, that essence and being are necessarily intertwined, interrelated through appearance. Their relation is nothing other than the movement of manifestation. This is a point I'm going to come back to. Right? The difference or the distinction that Hegel's drawing in the doctrine of essence between appearance, Erscheinung, and manifestation. That is the movement of essence appearing as the grounding condition for all that is. The ground condition, whether you think of that as essence, as the thing, the world in itself, the whole, the force, the inner, and that which it grounds, as concrete existence, the properties, the world of appearance, the parts expression, outer, or moments of one totality. So actuality is named then the unity of essence and concrete existence. And as we saw at the end of class last quarter, he elaborates that in terms of the how of that. What's the how of that unity? That's modality. And what is the what of that unity, right? What's the causality of that unity? All right. So I think a helpful way of thinking about what Hegel's argued up to this point is everything is in thoroughgoing relationality with everything else. That he's argued. That for anything to be, it necessarily is caught up and entangled with everything else. It can't but be. It can't be but entangled with everything else. But that entanglement, that relationality, has two different ways of being thought. And that's the distinction between appearance and manifestation that the doctrine of essence really turns around on. His claim is that the essential, what he calls the essential relation, which is the relation of appearance, is a relation between a ground and what it grounds, a ground and the grounded. So the thing for properties, the world in itself for the world of appearance, the whole or the force for the parts and the expression. Those are essential relations. Can't have one without the other, but one, in the essential relation, one has priority over the other. One is the ground of the other. One is the essence ground. The other is the grounded being, which is dependent upon the other, anchored in it. But Hegel's argument, right, as we saw, is that the essential relation of ground and grounded ultimately proves out that you can't say one has priority over the other. They are moments of the same expression, as he said. That you might want to say, and there's reasons to say at certain points, the thing is more fundamental than its properties. But when you look at, just to take that as one of the essential relations, but if you look at it, if you look at the thing, what is the thing? The thing is nothing over and above its properties. It just is those properties. So the essential relation, which asserts a priority, a hierarchy of the ground over the grounded, ultimately proves out not to be able to support that hierarchical relation undermines itself. Because there is no ground without the grounded, and in fact, further than that, the ground just is the grounded. In fact, that whole relationship is a moment of, as he says at the end of that discussion, expression. The thing expresses itself in its properties. The world in itself expresses itself in the world of appearance. There is no distinction to be made ultimately. They are part and parcel of literally the same movement. So that's a movement from, as he says, the essential relation of appearance to the absolute relation of manifestation. The absolute relation of manifestation. That's why he takes up in this final chapter now this question about the absolute relation, and he looks at it in terms of substantiality, causality, and reciprocity. This is him trying to think, okay, what does it mean to manifest? If manifesting is not the manifesting of something, right? You could say the appearance is the appearance of the ground and the grounded. Yep. You could say the appearance of the thing in itself, the world in itself, appears in the world of appearance. So it's an appearance of something. But manifestation is not a manifestation of something. This is the thing he insists on, that we've gotten to a point now where there's not something more fundamental than the process. It just is the process. So we've moved from the basic argument, the flow of the argument in the doctrine of essence, and the objective logic in general, is to demonstrate that everything is what it is by virtue of being entangled with everything else, relationality. But that relationality is not essential relationality, ultimately. It's not where there's a ground that supports everything underneath it as its ground and then gets expressed in its ground in its grounding work. Rather, it manifests itself. The whole thing is a work of manifestation. There is nothing outside of the process of expression itself. That's what he's trying to elaborate in substantiality, causality, and reciprocity, what he calls the absolute relation. So we've moved from relationality now to the generative process of its own terms. Make some sense? So this is the shift, right, that's going on at the end of the objective logic, and it's going to become the primary thing in the doctrine of the concept, where we're about to head. Now, I think it's always helpful at this point to say, okay, why can't we stop? It's a legitimate question. You could say to Hegel, at this point, right, there's a little more work to be done, we'll get there and we'll do it, but he's argued that for anything to be, it's necessarily tied up with everything else that is. That everything is in thoroughgoing relational. That's what he's arguing. Nothing can exist, literally nothing can exist without it being tied up in relationship to everything else that exists. So he's a relationalist, he's a holist, he's a monist. And yeah, he wants to say, well, look, there's a process going on here by which this relationality is engendered, produced, caused, created. And you'll say, right, there's a process here, but that process we've already had it elaborate. I mean, that process is just the work of determinate negation. We see that with now finally, that there's possibility within a state of affairs, and when that state of affairs gets ripe, that state of affairs engenders another state of affairs. Whenever the conditions are complete, right, when they're finished, then the fact emerges, he says. The next thing happens. The next state of affairs arises, and so on and so forth. And there we go. We're done, right? What else can we say about this process other than it's what he says here, which is it's the blind collapse into otherness. It just, anytime you get something set up, it's going to eventually get turned over. This is what the Greeks knew as fate, right? Anytime you think things are stable, they're not, right? They're always ultimately going to fall apart. So, what more needs to be said? Why can't we stop here? Why aren't we done at this point? Why is Hegel insisting that there has to be more here? Because Hegel is convinced that nothing we've set up to this point, literally, and this is frustrating, right? Nothing we've set up to this point is an elaboration that's adequate to that process on its own terms. We've talked about the process and what it does. We've talked about the process through its products, if you want to put it in those terms, through what it's achieved, through its accomplishments, through its destructive and creative accomplishments, for what it brings about, but also what it undermines. That's what we've done. We've shown that. But none of that is the rule governance of the process itself. It's what the process engendered, but not what the process is on its own terms. Hegel is continually, we've seen this is literally from the very first page. Hegel is trying to figure out the logic of this process of negation itself. And every time we do, what we get is relata and relations. And that's not the process. So we're looking for a processional, not a pretty term, I apologize, a processional logic. A logic that will be the rule governance of this, the rule governance, the law of this process, the law of this manifestation itself. That's what reason demands. Otherwise, this blind collapse into otherness is like fate was for the Greeks. And we say, it just happens, man. We have no idea why it happens. It just happens. Right? Have you read the tragedians? It happens. And that's the best we can do with it. And Hegel wants to say, That's actually not the best we can do. The best we can do with it is we can actually see if we can figure out the logic of it on its own terms. Now there's the question, what is the concept? Because the concept is the term he wants to use to denote that process. This is why concept sounds like a weird term to use for it, but concept marks, denotes this process. And he thinks there's a logic to this concept that's discernible, that we can grasp. It's not a matter of just, oh, damn, it happens. Oh, we recognize it all the time, or we must accede to it. You can actually know what its rule governance is. We can know that as well. Now, the Greeks would have told you that's the definition of hubris. Literally the definition of hubris. To think you know what's fated, that's way beyond the human span of knowledge. And Hegel wants to say, I understand that. I got that. I read those. And yet, maybe we weren't patient enough there. Maybe we were too quick. Maybe that's what was going on there. Maybe we should heed the tragedian, warning, but not run away. Maybe we should stay with it. Maybe there's something there to be discerned. Maybe we can discern it. So what is then the logic of that generative process itself? Now, Hegel thinks he can tell you what it is, and he does tell you what it is, on the final page of the objective logic. This is on page 505. Now, we're going to come back to this, obviously. I'm not going to, in the next 2 minutes, say, see, it's all done, we're good. But I am going to try to point out to you where he thinks he's able to start identifying this, and then this is the launch pad for the entirety of the document, the concept. So this is page 504, it's 409 in German. 504 at the bottom. So here's the final paragraph in the objective logic. No longer, therefore, does absolute substance as self-differentiating absolute form repel itself as necessity from itself. Well, that's what we thought it was, right? It's blind collapse into otherness. So no longer, what do you mean no longer it doesn't do that? We've reached some other insight here? Is that what you're telling us? Yep. Nor does it fall apart as contingency in indifferent external substances. So it doesn't do what we thought it did so far. There's something more to be grasped. But on the contrary, and here he now begins to talk about this process on its own. It differentiates itself, okay, so it's immanent differentiation, on the one hand into the totality, the heretofore passive substance. We'll have to come back and figure out, oh, what's passive substance? Which is at the origin, as the reflection from internal determinateness, as simple whole that contains its positiveness within itself, and in this positiveness is posited as self-identical. This is the universal. Now look, typical Hegel, ton of stuff packed into that. What the hell does any of it mean? At least what he's introduced here is he said, you know what one moment of the logic of the process is? Universality. This is the universal. Something, a term he hasn't used up to this point, but he thinks is rightly used it now for reasons we'll talk about. Then he says it differentiates itself. It differentiates itself into this moment of universality. Then he says, on the other hand, so here's the other side of what it differentiates itself into the totality, what he calls the hitherto causal substance, not the passive substance, but the causal or active substance, which is the reflection equally from internal determinateness into the negative determinateness, which, just as the self-identical determinateness, equally as the whole, but posited as the self-identical negativity, the singular. Again, you want to say, what the hell is any of that? But I've got universal now, and I've got singular or individual. But then look at what he says. But because the universal is self-identical, okay, so universality is what? Self-sameness, self-identity, fine. Only in that the determinants that it holds within is sublated. Hence, it is the negative as negative. It immediately is the same negativity that singularity is. So they're not separate from one another. Whatever else that other stuff meant, universality and singularity bear some relationship to one another. They are the same. And the singularity, because it equally is the determined, the negative as negative, immediately is the same identity that universality is. So they're the same. Their simple identity, is the particularity. that from the singular holds the moment of determinateness, from the universal, that of immanent reflection, the two in immediate unity. All right, there's a ton of stuff in there. We'll try to unpack it a little bit later. But what I'd like for you to hold on to there is he's saying there are three moments here: universality, individuality, particularity. Universality, singularity, individuality, we'll use those terms interchangeably, particularity. And particularity comes last in the enumeration of them because it seems to be unpacking what both of them, what connects both of them together. He then says, these three totalities, universality, singularity, particularity, are therefore one and the same reflection that as negative self-reference and self-relation differentiates itself into the other two totalities, but as into a perfectly transparent difference, a difference where there is a difference, namely into the determinate simplicity or into the simple determinateness, which is their one same identity. Okay, thanks a lot for nothing. Right? What does that tell us? We don't know. But then he says, this is a concept. Now that's Hegel's way of telling you, we've just happened on something, happened is not quite the right term, but we've just gotten into something that's not where we've been before. And it's what we've always wanted to get to, so to speak. It's what we've been coming up to the precipice of every single time, but we've always dropped back into relational terminology. This is not relational terminology. Well, it is, isn't it? I mean, isn't universality, individuality, particularity, isn't that just another set of relations? Hegel is adamant that that's not relationality. Why? Because universality, here's the ultimate answer we'll have to see. It's headed out here. We'll have to see it explored in the next series of discussions. Universality is what it is only as far as it particularizes itself, and it particularizes itself into individuality. There are three moments of one process. So unlike everything else we've been talking about, which has been relational, those three totalities, those three moments, are processional. This is the logic of the process itself. That's why he says, this is the concept. And then he wants to say, which is kind of stunning, the realm of subjectivity, so the subjective logic, or of freedom. Now, we've scratched our head many, many times, and will many, many more times as we go through the logic. But this is one of the head scratchers, right? You look at this, one of those moments where you look at it and you go, okay, maybe. Maybe we've reached something different here, and maybe that something different is processional rather than just relational. Maybe I buy that, maybe I don't, but maybe I buy that a little bit at least. Here's what I'm really thinking. I'm thinking that we're done at that point, and we don't really need any elaboration of that. So yay, we made it to the concept. And here's what also I'm thinking. I'm thinking that doesn't have anything to do with the notion of freedom. Everything I've said up to this point says what? That everything is necessarily entangled with everything else. That for anything to be, it is of necessity. And is of necessity means it's necessarily following from, relative necessity, follows from the prior state of affairs. Okay, great, wonderful. So everything is of necessity in that sense. Everything is of necessity in the sense that it's contingent on everything else. Great. But what's any of that got to do with freedom? I mean, you're not mistaken, right? When you read that line, you should have looked at it and gone, freedom? I'm sorry. What I know of freedom hasn't shown up anywhere in here, and I'm kind of a little afraid that if we really buy what Hegel is saying, that there ain't no freedom in here. Because what we standardly, conventionally mean by freedom is something like freedom of the will, where we mean something like the ability to make a choice between two options, a conception that's as old as Aristotle and before. And it sounds like, don't know, but it sounds like it could be something like that. It's compromised here. There's no freedom in that sense here. So how in the world could this process, this generative process, be freedom? Why would we call it that? Why is that the right name for it? Why is that got anything to do with subjectivity? So a lot of questions at that point, right? If you buy Hegel up to this level and you stop before this paragraph, at the bottom of 504 to the top of 505, you could just say, all right, Hegel is a better version, maybe you don't think it's better, a more robust version of Spinozistic monism. He's got a kind of, broadly speaking, enlivened substance. It's processional in some kind of way, but you don't actually know the logic of that procession. But everything is what it is by virtue of everything else being what it is, and therefore that's all that there is, and that's the process. And so you can say all is one in that sense, and we're kind of Spinozist in this sense. This is what Herder said. Right? Herder famously said, what we need is a Leibnizian Spinoza, which was kind of anathema, right? How could you reconcile Leibniz and Spinoza? But Herder famously said, well, you need to see that there is little force of compulsion that you have, which Spinoza picked up from Hobbes, really, and made into an ontological principle that pushes through things. There's that moving through all things. You need to really expand that in a kind of Leibnizian entelechy way, and you would have a kind of enlivened, almost vitalistic, Spinozistic metaphysics, which is exactly what you get in what Herder called the world soul. And that's his monism, right? That's the conception you can get out of something like that. Hegel's well aware of that, and yet he doesn't do that. Doesn't do that. So I think this is a point of commonality with a lot of that discussion that's going on at the time. A lot of people would have read up to here and said, I didn't get a bit of it, but if this is the big grand picture, I think I'm on board. And Hegel will say, great, glad to have you, but we're not done. They're like, why aren't you done? And he says, well, because we haven't really thought through the logic of the concept. And they'll say, well, great, what's the logic of the concept? Freedom. I'm sorry, where did that come from? How can we think freedom here? Well, now, I mentioned this last quarter, so let me just put this in place again so we can think about it as we move through this last section in particular. Because that's really where it ultimately gets laid out, but it's been in place for quite a while. For years, I read this sort of autobiographical might help a little bit. I read The Science of Logic and thought, yeah, what the hell has freedom got to do with any of this? I mean, freedom is a kind of miscategory. It doesn't belong here. It's a category mistake to invoke freedom at this point. You can see him invoke life. He'll say at a certain point there, this looks like a complete mistake, right? It doesn't belong in the logic. And already it doesn't like, freedom ought to belong in the logic. So what's it doing here? And I think he's prepared it in this way. He's prepared in this way because he's forced us to think through what it is for something to be. And what it is for something to be is for it to flow from a prior state of affairs. And it flows from a prior state of affairs because of a causal power that's engendering it. Now, that causal power is blind, so it doesn't know where it's headed, doesn't know where it's going, doesn't have a plan in place. So this is not Leibniz. Right? This is not the entelechies working the wisdom of God out, that God has implanted in all things. It's not happening that way. But Hegel does think that there is a causal power at work. And that causal power, though it doesn't have directionality about it, is nonetheless responsible for bringing things about. So it's reasonable to ask of that causal power, what brings it about? And Hegel is convinced that if the causal power is really the ultimate causal power, then it has to bring itself about. It has to cause itself. Now he's going to argue for this in just a moment, right? So literally how he's going to argue for the notion of causality, that substance entails causality, and causality of a certain kind. That causality of a certain kind is going to be self-engendering causality. It's going to be a causality that engenders its own self. It causes itself because it causes its own cause. It produces its own cause. And therefore it's self-engendering, it's self-causing. And the reason why I'm pushing that is because I think that's what Hegel means by freedom here, just to put it bluntly. That what Hegel means by freedom is not choice, freedom of the will. That's pretty clear, right? He's not talking about freedom of the will. The will doesn't have any place here. So, stupid Kevin, why'd you ever think that freedom of the will was an issue? Right, go away. But what kind of freedom is he talking about here? He's talking about what, as I mentioned before to you, he's talking about what Kant called transcendental freedom. Transcendental freedom. That's why I think he's picked up this term freedom. Transcendental freedom. Because that's the freedom that Kant says in the first critique already, but it's in the second critique as well. That's the freedom that God has to cause things from out of his own nature. To be self-causative. We don't have that freedom. Right? So, according to Kant, Kant says all the time, we have practical freedom. And practical freedom is always conditioned. It's always got emotions and feelings and whatnot that are impinging upon it. And then we act in accordance with those things. We make choices. We have to occur out of our villa, right? That's the way Kant thinks about it. But to give us a kind of model to contrast ourselves with, which Kant's always doing, right? What's the divine model over against which we can understand the human? And the divine model of freedom is fully self-causative. We don't have that. Pure spontaneity. We don't have that. God has that. If anything, the idea of God has that. So we can do a comparison. Remember, Kant's not committed to the existence of such a being, just the idea of such a being. Well, Hegel's arguing that there's actually a process that produces all things. And if it's really going to produce all things, it's also got to produce itself. And if it produces itself, then it's free in precisely that sense. It's self-engendering, it's self-causative. So freedom is not out of the issue here. And it is just what necessity is. Necessity is self-engendering determinate negation. That's freedom. So already we're getting a sense of, then we have to be able to think of a process that engenders itself. What would its logic be? It would have to be a processional logic, self-engendering logic, and that's what universality, particularization, and individuality are supposed to get us. Does that make a little bit of sense? That's the bomb he's dropping at the end here of the objective logic, and we're now about to go explore in detail, right, in the Doctrine of the Concept. All right, let's come back then to the beginning of the absolute relation chapter. This is page 489. Work our way, wind our way through to that final section, and we'll work through that section fairly closely. So, the absolute relation chapter is about substance, cause, and reciprocity. These are no big surprises if you've been in the first critique of Kant, because you know that the 12 categories, these are the last three, right? Substance, cause, and reciprocity. But look at how he works through them. Right? He says immediately that substance is nothing unto itself. Right? Substance is nothing unto itself. So it's not a ground all of a sudden. We're not getting a reassertion of ground. So how do we think of substance here? Substance is what it is only so far as it generates accidents. It is, he says literally, substance is the process of self-manifestation. So substance is nothing over, nothing less. It's nothing other than necessity itself. It just is the positing of accidents and nothing more. There's nothing left over, nothing left behind. He calls this on page 490, this is right at the beginning of the last paragraph down, he calls this the movement of accidentality. The movement of accidentality. So he's quite aware that the standard way of thinking about substance, upokaimenon, that which exists under, that which is the bearer of accidents, he's aware of that tradition. And so he's saying this isn't a accidents are born by the substance. The substance is this movement of producing accidents itself, producing this movement of accidentality. He goes so far as to pull a word out of Schelling. Right? Actuosity is a Schellingian word. Schelling had already used this in the Weltautor, and no, he used it earlier than that. I'm forgetting where he used it in. I got it written down someplace. Yeah, Schelling. Yeah, he used it in there's a little text called Bruno, or on the philosophy, the nature of philosophy, that Schelling wrote in 1802. 1802, prime years for when he and Hegel were working together. So it's pretty clear that Hegel's picked up this term actuosity and pulled it from Schelling, and says that's what substance is. Substance is a process. Substance is nothing unto itself. It's not a thing. It's not a bearer of accidents. So it causes its accidents. If you want to really think about what it is, as he says in the middle of 491, then you have to think of it as Macht, as power. That's all substance is. It's power. So substance is the power that creates, it posits, as he says, its accidents, and it destroys or excludes them as well. It's therefore necessity as negation. It both produces its accidents and it negates those productions. But he does say on 492, right in the middle of 492, right in the middle, page 492, that as this Macht, it is still what he calls the inner of the accidents. The inner, that which is held within the accidents, what bears, in a sense, the accidents. 492, right in the middle of the page. This is 396 in the German. He writes, about halfway down the page. The relation of substantiality is at first, therefore, only this. Everybody see where I'm at? About halfway down the page. The relation of substantiality is at first, therefore, only this. That substance manifests itself as a formal power whose differences are not substantial. So it just produces itself, right? It just produces accidents. It manifests itself. It shows itself. In fact, substance only is, so initially it looks like that, but in fact, here's what it turns out to be. Substance only is as the inner of the accidents, and these are only in the substance. So now it's taking on a kind of status of its own. It holds, it bears these accidents. So it was initially just purely actuosity, purely movement of accidentality, but then it's the bearer of the accidents that it produces. Or this relation is only the shining of totality as becoming. So here he's coming back and talking about this process that we've been grappling with since becoming, since being nothing becoming. But it is equally reflection, so there's the other term we've been using for this. And for this reason, the accidentality which substance is, in itself is also posited as such. It is thus determined as self-relating negativity over against itself, determined as self-relating, simple identity with itself, and it is substance that exists in and for itself, substance endowed with power. Literally in German, it's a powerful substance. Right? Thus, the relation of substantiality passes into the relation of causality. Why? Because now we can talk about the substance as the cause of its effects, the accidents. So now we've moved from substantiality, which was initially just actuosity, just the movement of accidentality, to talking about, no, there's actually built up here a concept of a cause, substance as the powerful cause, the powerful substance, causes these accidents. They are its effects. So now we can talk about a causal relationship, a cause-effect relationship. So we were just talking about manifestation. Now we're talking about two moments of manifestation, cause and effect. So far, so good? So look at what he does with this. He walks us through causality now. So at first, cause and effect are moments of the movement of power. They're identical implicitly, not explicitly, but they're identical implicitly. There's nothing in the cause that's not in the effect, and there's nothing in the effect that's not in the cause. The cause, we can say, is extinguished it manifests itself, or we can even say it disappears, entirely in the effect. So cause and effect are therefore inseparable. And yet, so you might think, oh, we're good then, we're done. No, Hegel says, there's something still here at work. There's some sort of stability that arises here. What's that? As we saw at the conclusion of the treatment of substantiality, the cause does have primacy here. The substance does have primacy here. The substance and not the accidents is what posits the other moment, the effect. And that's what he calls formal causality. Formal causality. He says here, substance stands as the non-posited original. This is on 493. The non-posited original, beginning of the second full paragraph down. Over against this positiveness reflected into itself, this determined as determined, there stands substance as the non-posited original. Under number 2. Why? Because it's what posits the effect, but it's not itself, at least at this initial stage, it's not itself positive. So as he says, this is on 494 now, next paragraph over, next page over, sorry. And this is the end of the paragraph from 493. So 398 in the German. He writes, the effect is therefore necessary because it is the manifestation of the cause, or is this necessity which the cause is. Only as this necessity is cause self-moving, self-initiating, without being solicited by another. Self-subsisting source of production out of itself, it must effect, werken, it must bring about, make something happen. Its originariness is this, that it is because its immanent reflection is a positing that determines, and conversely, the two are one unity. So as the cause is completely manifested in the effect, we have these two moments which can stand external to the process, the cause and the effect. And this is what he means by determinate causality. So formal causality is where you've got the two moments, but they're buried in one another. But one of them does have priority. That is, the substance is the cause, the effects are the result. So you can distinguish them, they can be extracted, right? They can stand out on their own. That's determinate relationality of causality itself. Here's where he gives famously, this is on 498, one of the few examples, I mentioned this last time, one of the few examples in the whole book. He gives you the example of, take a stone that moves. Where did this come from, right? Why couldn't you have this from page 1? No. He writes this is on page 498. Take a stone that moves. It is a cause. Its movement is the determination which it has. But besides it, it contains yet many other determinations, color, shape, and so on, that do not enter into its causality. Because its immediate concrete existence is separated from its form connection, namely the form of causality, the latter is something external. The stone's movement and the causality attaching to it is in it only positiveness. So look, you could talk about a stone into itself, and yeah, it can be a cause of something else, it can change something and move something else, but it doesn't have to do that. So it's separable in this way. It's a cause, and its effects are separable from it. He says the same thing about rain. Take a look now in the same paragraph down. Or again, rain is the cause of wetness, which is the same water as the rain. This water has the determination being rain, cause, because this determination has been posited in it by another force, or what have you, has lifted it into the air and compressed it into a mass, the weight of which makes it fall. It's being removed from the earth is a determination alien to its original self-identity, to its gravity. Its causality consists in removing such determination and restoring its original identity, but this means also subletting its causality. Now, having identified this, having said, look, if we're talking about the causal relationship, then it can always talk about two moments of the causal relationship, the causal side and the effect side. The cause will have a priority over against the effect side, right? So that's, kind of, at that moment, if we don't fall completely into mechanism, right? If we just let it say, well, this is causality, then yeah, that makes some sense. We can talk about it in those terms. And Hegel's now giving you examples, right? A stone can be a cause of something else. Wet can be rain can be the cause of something else being wet. These are things that have effects, but they stand on their own. But then you could ask of them, here's where he goes with this. What causes the cause? You know where this heads. Look what he says in the next paragraph. We now consider the second determinants of causality, which concerns form. This relation is causality external to itself. You pulled out the two moments. You pulled out the cause and the effect. And now the causal process, has these two moments which we've extracted from it. They can stand on their own, but what happens when you put them on their own? Here's what happens. As the originariness which is within it just as much as positive or effect, this union of opposite determination is in an existent substance, constitutes the infinite regress from cause to cause. So once you pull the stone out and say, well, it can have effects. Once you pull the rain out and say, well, it can have effects, you pulled it out from its causal process, then what happens? You immediately have the question come upon you, what brought about it? What brought about the stone? What brought about the rain? That's an infinite regress. The cause of the cause, and of course the cause of that cause, and of course the cause of that cause. Here we have this bad infinite regress problem that we've seen in the doctrine of being recur here in the doctrine of essence in terms of causality. Now what he also will tell you, this is on page 499, the first full paragraph down on 499, is exactly the same as the case of the effect, or rather the endless progression from effect to effect. So rain causes something to be wet, but then the wet causes something else to be damp. It causes something else. So now we get to go on down that route, which is also an infinite progression, not regression. But you get, as he says, reminds us what we found again. This is page 499, right at 404 in the German paragraph just before 3. We've now come to what he calls here bad infinity again. Bad infinity. Yeah. We've seen Hegel grapple with this problem before in a variety of different levels. But here's the level of causality being itself bad infinite in terms of the causality, in terms of the cause side, and the effect side. But look at what he says in this next paragraph, 3. This is on the bottom of 499. So is everybody together? Lost anybody? We good? So manifestation is causality, but manifestation can be extracted out to what's the cause of the manifestation, and what's the effect of the manifestation, and that leads to this bad infinity problem either side again. Then Hegel says this. We now have to see what has resulted from the movement of determinate causality. So that's always Hegel saying, all right, I know where we've gotten to, but let's slow down and see what we've actually demonstrated. Formal causality, that's causal, there's no separation between the cause and the effect. The cause just is the effect. The effect is what the cause gives it. Formal causality expires in the effect. It extinguishes itself, it expires in the effect. It's done, there's nothing more to it. So there's no stone laying around afterwards. There's no rain laying around afterwards. It's not how you think about this. You have to think about it as a process. Formal causality expires in the effect, and the element of identity of these two moments emerges as a result. But it does so only as an implicit unity. Hasn't been made explicit yet. It's an implicit unity of cause and effect, to which the form connection is external. So that was the problem there. There was an identity of cause and effect in formal causality. There was no cause without effect, there is no effect without cause. But it hasn't been explicitly shown as such. For this reason, he says, the element of identity is immediate. Hasn't been made explicit yet. It's there, but it's immediate. It's not been made explicit. The element of identity is immediate also with respect to both of the two determinations of immediacy. Both the cause and the effect have this immediacy. Let me just finish this and I'll take questions. First, as in itself, it's a content on which causality is deployed externally. And second, as a concrete existent substrate in which cause and effect inhere as different determinations of form. In this substrate, the two determinations are implicitly one. Cause and effect are implicitly one, say in the stone, in rain. But on account of this implicitness or of the externality of form, each is external to itself. You can extract them and pull them out. You can say, well, the stone on its own terms, the rain on its own terms. And hence, in its unity with the other, is also determined as other with respect to it. So you can separate out the cause from its effect and the effect from the cause. Consequently, the cause has indeed an effect. Notice, has indeed an effect. It's not just its effect. It has an effect. And it is at the same time itself effect. So it has an effect, and it also is that effect. And the effect not only has a cause, but is itself also cause. And this is the problem. This is the problem. This is where you get bad infinity. Is that you get the identity of the two, that the cause just is the effect, and the effect just is the cause. That's been submerged, and you focus on just the two moments separable unto themselves. The cause has an effect. But when it has an effect, you ask, well, what's the cause of the cause? The cause has an effect. It has an effect. The effect is separable. What's the effect of the effect? Progression down that road. But then look what he says. And I'll come back and take questions, John. I know you have a question, but just follow this through. But the effect which the cause has and the effect which it is are different. How are they different? He says, as are also the cause which the effect has and the cause which it is. How are they different? Here's the next paragraph. The outcome of the movement of the determinate relation of causality is then this, that the cause does not just expire in the effect, and thereby the effect as well as informal causality, but that by expiring in the effect, the cause comes to be again. Read that again. The outcome of the movement of determinate relation of causality, what we've just been exploring, which led to bad infinity. Right? The outcome of that is then this, that the cause does not just expire in the effect, as it did in formal causality. That's all there was to it. It's over with. But it doesn't just expire. And thereby the effect as well as in formal causality. But that by expiring in the effect, the cause comes to be again. That the effect vanishes in the cause, but equally comes to be again in it. Now look, this is the setup for action and reaction, which is going to work through the details of this, and eventually reciprocity. But notice what he's saying. He's saying already that the cause in expiring in the effect comes to be again in the effect. And the effect, in being where the cause expires, comes to be in being that where it expires. So he's reasserting what was implicit at the level of the formal. He's reasserting now and now saying that's been made explicit now. Now, you could also see that it runs into these problems of bad infinity. Right, sure, fine. But it also demonstrates that you don't have one without the other, that they're actually ontologically inseparable from one another. So when he says that by expiring the effect, the cause comes to be again, that the effect vanishes in the cause, but equally comes to be again in it, he's saying literally these things produce each other. That the process is more fundamental than the relata, that the process we've been focusing on in the process. Each of these determinations sublates itself in its positing and posits itself in its ablating. What we have is not an external transition of causality from one substrate to another. There's the breaking of that whole idea that, oh, the stone is causing something that stands over against, separate from something else. The rain causes wetness that stands over separate from. It's not transferring its power. It's not communicating its power to something else. He says, what we have is not an external transition of causality from one substrate to another, but it's becoming other, cause becoming other than itself, and in effect becoming other than itself and its cause, is at the same time its own positing. There is no cause unless it produces an effect. There is no effect unless it produces the cause. So the causal process is more fundamental than cause or effect itself. He says, causality thus presupposes itself or conditions itself. We're one step away from produces itself. The previously only implicit identity, which is what we had in formal causality between cause and effect, the substrate is therefore now determined as presupposition or posited as against the efficient causality. The reflection hitherto only external to the identity is now in relation to it. And he elaborates this in the next section, so we'll go there, but I just wanted to point out that fairly significant shift. John, I made you wait a long time, thank you.
Oh, no, you answered the question.
Oh.
Actually, I was just going to clarify implicit unity, but yeah.
So it was always there, right? The implicit unity of cause and effect is already there. If you ask, if you look at formal causality and say, well, there's no cause without effect, there's no effect without cause. Right, I got that, we're good, we're done. Well, Hegel will say, right, but it's just implicit there. It hasn't actually been rendered explicit, it hasn't been worked through. And when you work it through, what happens? Well, both moments can stand on their own. Right? The causal moment can stand on its own. This is determinate causality now. Determinate causality means the causal moment can stand on its own. The effect moment can stand on its own, and that produces their own endless progression or endless regression. Is that all there is there? No, he says. Because what you see now very clearly that you couldn't see in formal causality alone itself is that it may look like the stone and the rain stand separate from what they cause, but they don't. They are produced by that causation. In fact, they're caused by the very causation that they bring about, supposedly. That's why he says it comes to be again. Right? The cause comes to be again in the very production of effects. And the effect comes to be in the expiring of the cause. It produces itself in that moment. Questions, comments about that? Now, what he does in pages 500 to 503 is he talks about what he calls the active substance and the passive substance. And what he's doing, as far as I can tell, this is a very convoluted, very difficult to try to understand. But what I think he's trying to do there is elaborate what he's just identified, which is the causal process engenders its own moments. The causal process engenders its own moments. Now, it's easy to read here because he talks about, well, there's a passive substance and there's an active substance. And it sounds as though he's reverted to talking about what he just said you can't talk about anymore, which is two substances interacting with one another. But I would submit to you that when he's talking about active and passive substance, he's not talking about them in the plural. He's not talking about them interacting with one another. He's talking about different dimensions of the same thing. The substance insofar as it's passive, the substance insofar as it's active. So think about it that way, not as designating two substances. One's passive, the other's active, is going to hit it. These aren't two billiard balls. One's sitting there, that's the passive one. It can sound like that sometimes, right? So you read it and go, oh, the passive substance is just a billiard ball sitting there, and the active substance is the one that's been knocked into it. That's not what he's doing. He's talking about the substance. He's talking about it in one sense active and in one sense receptive. That's the same substance. So he says this. Look on 500. Action and reaction, part C. Causality is a presupposing activity. A presupposing. Take something for granted. How so? The cause is conditioned. That's what he means by presupposing. It's something already there working on the cause itself. There's not a freestanding cause, at least initially. It is a negative relation to itself as a presupposed, as an external other which is in itself, but only in itself, is causality itself. This other, as we have seen, is, as we have seen, the substantial identity into which formal causality passes over, which now has determined itself as against this causality, as its negative. Or it is the same as the substance of the causal relation, but a substance that is confronted by the power of accidentality as itself substantial activity. It is the passive substance. So passive substance is the substance that gives off these accidents. Passive is that which is immediate, or that which exists in itself, but is not also for itself, not also for itself. Pure being or essence is just in just this determinateness of abstract self-relation, self-identity. Confronting the passive substance is the negatively self-relating, the efficient substance. So when confronting it, it sounds like, oh, it's talking about another. They're in relation to one another. There's two billiard balls. But look at how he talks about it. It is cause inasmuch as in determinate causality, it has restored itself out of the effect through the negation of itself, a reflected being, which in its otherness or as immediate behaves essentially as a positing activity, and through its negation mediates itself. Here, therefore, causality no longer has a substrate in which it inheres. It is not a determination of form as against this identity, but is itself substance. Or in other words, causality alone is at the origin. The substrate is the passive substance which causality has presupposed for itself. So where do we begin? We begin with the passive substance that gives rise to what? Accidents. But what do we find out? That it's produced. That the passive substance itself is produced. Now he says it can undergo this process of production. And when it undergoes the passive substance, when it undergoes this process of causality, it then suffers violence, right? It suffers Gewalt, right? It suffers power being exerted upon it. But look at what he says about it. This is on 501, it's the second full paragraph down. To this extent, he's talking about the passive substance, suffers violence, Gewalt. Violence is the appearance of power, Macht, or power as external. But power is something external only insofar as it is an action. That is, in the positing of itself, the causal substance is at the same time a presupposing, that is, posits itself as sublated. Conversely, the act of violence is therefore equally an act of power. The violent cause acts only on an other which it presupposes. Its effect on it is its negative self-relation, or the manifestation of itself. Excuse me. So notice what he's doing. He's arguing that the passive substance, which we just take for granted, is just there and giving off this causality, is actually being produced through this process. What looks initially as though it's a violence inflicted upon it, and therefore there's the appearance of power, right, from something else being exerted upon it, turns out to be what? A manifestation of power itself. So it's not something other than it, it's itself. It's producing itself. Take a look on 502. Top of page 502. Passive substance, therefore, is only given its due by the action on it of another power. This is what violence is. What it loses is the immediacy it had, the substantiality alien to it. What comes to it as an alien something, namely that which is determined as a positiveness, is its own determination. But now, in being determined in its positiveness, or in its own determination, the result is that it is not sublated, but rather that it only rejoins itself, and in its being determined is therefore an originariness. On the one hand, therefore, the passive substance is preserved or posited by the active, namely insofar as the latter sublates itself. But on the other hand, it is the act of the passive substance itself, the act of the passive substance, which is, a misnomer, right? Passive substance is not supposed to act, but it does act. That's the whole point. The act of the passive substance itself to rejoin itself, and thus to make itself into what is originary and a cause, being posited by another and its own becoming are one and the same. So what looked to be merely just sitting there, the passive substance, bearing its accidents and suffering the violence of causality to it, it actually turns out that it is the process. That process is what engenders it. It's what produces it. And it's its own act of engendering. It produces itself. He concludes this analysis on 503. We'll take a break with this. Take a look at the top of 503. Further, causality behaves in all this as passive substance. But as we have seen, the latter, passive substance, right, the latter becomes causal through the effect it incurs. That's a weird statement. It becomes causal by being affected. It becomes power by being violently overtaken. That first cause, the one which acts first and receives its effect back into itself as a reaction, thus comes up again as a cause, whereby the activity which in finite causality runs into the bad infinite progression is bent around and becomes an action that returns to itself, an infinite reciprocal action. So it looks like passive substance is inflicted initially by active substance and rendered kind of violent, overthrown, takeover. Water is spilt onto the table. The table bears it. Passive substance. But Hegel's point is that no, actually what's going on there is the table is being created. This whole activity is not something that's external to it at all. That it actually is the production of that whole process itself. They're all both caught up in this process of manifestation. That's what he means by the bad infinite progression is bent around. It doesn't go off into progression forever. It doesn't go all the way back into regression forever. It's in this thing itself. It's in this process of engendering itself. But that means that the cause, let me put it this way, that the passive substance is its own active substance. That it is causal precisely when it incurs an effect. And that's how it becomes itself. So it engenders itself. It produces itself. That's what he means by infinite reciprocal action. So at that point, Hegel thinks, look, when we're talking about the logic of manifestation, we're talking about the logic of this process as a logic of causality, then the two moments of causality can't be separated out from it. You've got to be seen together in it. It has to be explicitly identified as that. And then we have to understand that in the causal side of that, the substance side of that, it may initially look like it's passive, but actually that passivity is what's engendered. It's what's produced. And at that moment, you're talking about a process that's self-engendering, self-acting, self-productive, self-causing. Now that sets up the final discussion in the reciprocity of action section. Does that at least make a little bit of sense to everyone? This is very difficult stuff. I'm not trying to make light of it and say it's also easy, but this is where he's trying to lead us. Does that make some sense? Let's take a 10-minute break. It's 4:40. Let's take a 10-minute break. Come back at 4:50, and we'll follow on from there and try to make some sense of this final section.